Welcome to the So What from BCG, the podcast that explores the big ideas shaping business, the economy and society. I'm Georgie Frost. In this episode, in this multipolar world filled with uncertainty about tariffs and trade, the Global South can still find opportunities for growth. What could this mean for your business? I'm joined today by Aparna Bharadwaj, BCG's global leader for the Global Advantage practice and author of a recent report on geopolitics and the future of trade. Aparna, what's your so what?
We are living in a multipolar world, some would say a fractured world. But in that situation, when supply chains are under stress, when costs of manufacturing are going up, there are 130 countries of the Global South, more than 60% of the global population, that are finding opportunity in adversity. In a fractured world, their narrative is one of resilience, but also one of growth.
While the world's attention has been diverted by geopolitical tensions and shifts in global trade, the Global South will continue to develop and navigate its own pathways. Earlier this year, economic growth through 2029 was projected to be more than twice as fast compared to advanced economies, setting up in a new role on the international stage. What impact will this have on the tumultuous future of global commerce? And what are the lessons and opportunities for business?
So what is the Global South? It is essentially about 130 individual markets. Most of them are emerging markets or middle-income countries. They are spread all over the world across Asia, Latin America, Africa. Together, they are just under 20% of global GDP, but they are over 60% of the global population. And they are growing twice as fast as the global north economies. So it's not exactly an alliance or an association of nations in that sense, but it is a group of countries that are crafting their own narrative in a multipolar world, that are, even though they are diverse, are forming their own set of strategies to compete and to even excel. So that's what we call the Global South.
Whenever I read about the Global South, it is from a perspective of the Global North or advanced economies. What is it from your perspective?
Actually, that is exactly the reason why we wanted to write about the Global South, because whenever we have seen narratives around this, in the media, or you hear those narratives in macroeconomic discussions, etc., it is always, like you said, with a Western gaze or a gaze of the Global North, which is essentially to say, oh, these are emerging markets, and how can, from large economies, multinational companies, how can they succeed in emerging markets, so on and so forth. What we wanted to do, and that's where I think this piece of work is different, it's a story of the Global South written by people who operate in the Global South. And essentially, the way this operates is these countries are looking at a world where there is the US with America First policies, there is China driving global diplomacy, there is Europe looking at their own path to competitiveness. And these 130 or so countries are asking, what do I do to create something that is valuable for me? I don't want to be allied with X or Y. I want to be able to do business with the East and the West across those geopolitical borderlines or fractures. How do I do that, right? And so they are being pragmatic. They are prioritizing economic growth over everything else. And they are saying, I will chart my own course here. So this is the narrative that we want to tell. It is, of course, a very diverse set of countries, but there are some common themes that we have started to see on how they're trying to do this. And for me, that's fascinating because a group of countries, often middle-sized economies, emerging markets, wanting to elevate their populations out of poverty, wanting to have more and more of their population become middle class, be able to grow, wanting to participate in global value chains, and doing that with the utmost pragmatism.
Well, let's dig into some of those. Let's go for the common themes first, and then I want to look at some of perhaps the individual strategies that are being used and deployed. So the common themes that you're noticing.
I'll actually talk about 4 common themes, but the one thing that unites it all is pragmatism, and pragmatism in multiple areas. So the first theme is that they are focusing on economic growth over everything else, right? So whenever there is a trade-off to be made, the questions they ask is, what's good for the economy, for elevating income levels of their populations, what's good for driving economic and GDP growth for them. This is a way to keep them grounded and relatively neutral. That means I'd like to be neutral in today's geopolitics. I'd like to trade with the whole world. For example, trade between the Global South and the Global North is set to grow much faster than global trade. At the same time, trade between Global South and China is set to grow nearly 6%. And trade between Global South countries is also growing much faster than global trade, almost 4%. So what they're saying is that I'd like to do business with everybody and I would like to focus on economic growth. The second theme is a strengthening footprint around trade. They're trying to create regional tie-ups, multilateral partnerships. They're trying to set up multilateral trade agreements that allow them to expand their ties with each other and expand their ties with the world. I'll give you an example of the ASEAN region where I work a lot. The 10 countries in the ASEAN bloc have really been working closely together with each other. They've recently crafted and are going to sign a digital framework agreement to collaborate on the digital economy. They are finding ways to work on pursuit of carbon neutrality as a bloc and how do I drive green economy in order to boost my overall economy, so on and so forth. Now, some of that requires, again, pragmatism. It requires a path to set aside differences you may have had in the past and find a way to work together in a way that allows you to be sustainably growing and be able to do this for several decades and not just for a few years. Now, many of these Global South countries are what we call connector economies. They are participating in global trade by connecting trading with China and connecting trade with the global north. And in order to do that, they need to have those multilateral partnerships. They need to be able to work across these boundaries. And that's what they're doing. The third theme is around geopolitical balancing act. This is not my terminology, but Danny Kwa of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy talks about a bicycle diplomacy, which says, you know, when you have two big cars in the front of a race, and they are both trying to overtake each other. There's a lot of chaos in the front. You take your bicycle and you sort of navigate around it and you find your own path. So it's not a political movement. It's not like the non-aligned movement from the Cold War era, but it's much more of an economic pragmatism to say, I'll keep my bicycle diplomacy alive and I'll find my own path through the geopolitical context that we are in. And the fourth theme is around climate. They are looking for solutions that are good for the climate and good for the economy. Now, interestingly, these 130 or so countries of the Global South are the ones with the most to lose through adverse climate situations, right? They know that. And so what they're doing is they're trying to find solutions that are good for the economy and good for the environment.
You said that every decision sort of ends up with economic growth first. How does that balance with climate and sustainability?
Actually, I think it is possible to not have to trade off between economic advantage and climate leadership. It is possible. And we've seen numerous examples of this. So Laos, which is an emerging market in ASEAN, has hydroelectric power. And they would like to export that hydroelectric power all over the world and certainly to other ASEAN nations. And so they are saying, I have a cost-effective way to produce green energy. How can I find a way through the ASEAN grid, through collaborations with other members of ASEAN who need that energy to be able to get value out of green energy? Similarly, many emerging markets have ocean economies or what we call blue economies, or they have carbon sinks that help offset carbon emissions all over the world. So there is actually a path by which you don't have to trade off between the environment and your economy.
Do you have any other examples that you can give me? You know, we spoke about the common themes, but now the more specifics, just not necessarily about climate, but generally how countries in the Global South are navigating their own paths. We've used that expression to growth and economic resilience. What examples do you have?
Another example would be the Indian economy. India is part of the Global South, but the largest nation population-wise in the Global South and incredibly important. So in order to drive a path to resilience, there's a few pathways for India. It was always a well-known service economy and a very thriving service economy, but India is now making a bid to be a significant manufacturing economy for the world. For India to be a part of the solution of China plus X strategies and to be a credible manufacturer, India has to import from China to export to the world. You're going to need equipment, you're going to need raw materials, you're going to need components. and then you will add value and you will export it to the rest of the world. And so you're starting to see diplomatic thawing of relationships between these two countries, trying to come together and work with each other. Resumptions of direct flights are on the table, doing more trade is on the table. You see Chinese businesses entering India. So this is another example of creating economic resilience. Yet another example is smaller nations of the global south who realize that to participate in the global value chain, I cannot produce everything in-house. I need to partner with other global south nations. So in ASEAN, for example, some nations provide commodities in the electric battery value chain or electric vehicle value chain. In the EV value chain, some nations are the ones providing critical minerals. Some of the ASEAN nations are doing the assembly. Other ASEAN nations are building components. So I think the pragmatism and that approach comes from the fact that as middle-sized economies, I could be relevant for 2 years, but I would like to be relevant for several decades. And if I have to be relevant for several decades and not be replaced by the next low-cost location, I need to find a way to team with others who are in the same boat as me, and I need to find a way to work with the so-called superpowers around the world to create a path for myself that doesn't allow me to be replaced within a couple of years, but allows a sustainable path to success that lasts a decade, several decades.
You've mentioned there about India and its role in individual countries. I want to sort of focus now on China. You've obviously mentioned China. What are you seeing in terms of China's role in the Global South story? How are nations responding to that influence, and what will that look like going forward?
So here is where, Georgie, the difference between a Western gaze and looking at it from the Global South gaze gives you a very new perspective. So often the narrative that I see here, when you look at it from a Global North standpoint, is we have US pursuing America first. What is the role of Europe to step in this vacuum and to create an opportunity for the world to navigate diplomacy? You hear that a lot, right? But the missing narrative here is the role of China. China is over 1/3 of global production. What we did is we looked at 2013, the Global South nations, those 130 or so nations, and we saw who are they trading with more, US, Europe, or China. And we looked at the same picture in 2023. We did the same for investments. And what you're seeing is the swing is massive. In 2023, a decade down the line, many more of these nations, in fact, over 65% of them are trading more with China than they are with the West. More of these nations are getting investments from China than they are from the West. China has a very important role to play in the Global South, and this is not something new. It starts with One Belt, One Road. It continues into continued investment over the last decade or so. It is also connected to trade, where these connected economies are trading with China and then trading with the world. And I think if you look at it from a Western gaze, you miss that. You miss that China is really emerging as a diplomatic, a trade partner of choice, often of no choice, for these Global South nations. And so when the Global North markets, especially the Western markets, retreat into themselves, this is the path that gets crafted, because then Chinese diplomacy fills in the vacuum left by the Western diplomacy. And in the Global South, this is very well understood. It's obvious. Therefore, the relationships with China, diplomatically and trade-wise, are incredibly important for nations of the Global South. And that's true for not just Asia, but also Latin America, also Africa.
What can leaders in the Global North do to flip the narrative, I suppose, in their own heads?
I'd say to business leaders of companies that are originating in the Global North to get people, CXOs, leaders, to have a seat at the table who are from the Global South, who understand this intrinsically. I'm someone who's spent nearly 25 years working in the Global South. And for me, this is obvious, but it's not obvious in all the boardrooms of the multinationals that we often work with. So finding people at that table in those boardrooms who understand, live and breathe this, to be able to bring that alternative to the Western gaze, is incredibly crucial. The second thing is to examine your supply chains very, very carefully. In today's context, having a supply chain where you're substituting one Global North solution with a different Global North solution may not be enough. Thinking about the plethora of options available in the Global South, and not just from a cost arbitrage, but also from a supply chain resilience perspective, creating optionality for yourself from a nearshoring perspective, is also incredibly important. The third thing I would say is it never harms you to build a geopolitical muscle. If you have a geopolitical muscle, you can think about this at a much more holistic level, and you can actually be able to unpack this and what it means for your business and be able to proactively plan around it.
You mentioned services in India and, of course, low-cost manufacturing, very famous Global South, if you're looking at it from a Global North perspective. But what industries are emerging as real growth drivers beyond the low-cost manufacturing, beyond services?
If you look at countries like Vietnam, if you look at countries like what India is trying to do, not there yet, but trying to do, or what Mexico has done really successfully, is to not just be a low-cost alternative, because that is a 5-year strategy. That's not a 15-year, a 20-year strategy. It's not the strategy to become the largest trading partner for the US, for example. What they are doing is they are trying to create a rapid innovation cycle. So I think that's what we need to really think about, to say it's not just an alternative for low-cost manufacturing, it's an alternative to access better skills affordably. It's an alternative to find innovation where people are able to leapfrog innovation. If you see the digital trajectory of Indian businesses, it leapfrogs businesses in the global north. That mindset shift is what will make us ask the right questions and therefore find the right answers.
You mentioned digital tech. What other areas are really exciting you?
I think green manufacturing, for sure. Electric vehicle production. Fascinating in terms of the possibilities for global South nations to participate in those green supply chains. Semiconductor technology, in fact, the entire tech value chain, you are seeing newer and newer players entering this space and coming up the curve here as well. Broadly, not just electric vehicles, but automotive sector in general. We are also seeing nations of the global South climb up the value chain on areas such as textiles, fashion. You saw the story of Bangladesh and how, except for recent events, Bangladesh really climbed up the curve on value-added textile manufacturing and becoming a key member of the fashion and apparel retail value chain. Vietnam went up the curve similarly on handphone manufacturing, on a variety of machinery manufacturing, so on and so forth. So you see endless examples of going up the curve, innovating faster, and being able to add value more proactively. I'm not saying it's perfect. Of course, there are ups and downs in this as well, and political stability often derails economic growth in these countries. But we are seeing several encouraging stories, and I feel very optimistic.
I want to talk about that optimism, because at a time when the world can feel quite changeable, fractured, volatile, perhaps, it sounds like this is actually a positive story, the Global South.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think it's the positivity of this that is the most attractive component for me, because I think we need this right now, Georgie. We need to be able to look at our geopolitical context and to look at the silver linings, look at the opportunities, and all business leaders need that. The other thing that I find really valuable is, in a tightly contested election, the swing states become very important. And this 18% of the global GDP is a swing state. It's open for business with both the left and the right, if I was to say that, right? And therefore, it's incredibly important. Emerging markets are so important in a multipolar world. That opportunity is what the governments of the Global South need to be able to be razor focused on and need to be able to capitalize on, right? Because if they get back to the petty politics or whatever it is, they would miss that opportunity. And I think they are. I think they are seeing it, and they are seeing the elevated importance of these swing states, and they're trying to find their path to get value for their countries and their economies out of it.
If we were to have this conversation in, let's say, a decade's time, and how difficult it is to gaze into the future, but how do you think the future of global commerce will be positioned? Where will the Global South be? What role will it play in the world? We talk about existing economic superpowers. Is that shifting? Is that changing? What do you think?
The optimist view is that if we can find a way for Global South nations to connect their supply chains to each other. Remember that China is a manufacturing giant. Over a third of global manufacturing in one country. This has not happened in recent history. But if a set of different medium-sized economies can work together, can integrate with each other, set up those trade deals, governments and businesses can collaborate with each other, the optimist view is that China plus X, and that X might be 10, might be 20, might be 25, can be real. And these combination of Global South economies can provide a genuine alternative, multiple alternatives to global supply chains that keeps the cost of production down, keeps supply chain resilience solid, and allows our globalized world to operate at a cost that is affordable that allows consumers to take advantage of a global market. That's the optimist view, right? I'm rooting for that. I've grown up in emerging markets, worked in emerging markets, and I'm rooting for that optimist view. But it will require governments and businesses to collaborate closely. It will require that business-minded policy in these governments. It will require also multi-regional partnerships and many, almost a mosaic of regional partnerships, sectoral partnerships to come together to make it all happen. It's a much more complicated world, but it could be the path to sustaining globalization in a different way. And it could be a path to growth for many of these emerging economies.
If you had one key piece of advice to business leaders in the Global South to make the most of the situation and to position themselves well, what would that be?
My one biggest advice would be upskill and innovate. Do not rely on the low-cost advantage. They need to move up the quality curve. They need to move up the innovation curve, and they need to upskill their workforce, especially on digital skills, on green skills, on the exact skills that are tight and not enough of in the global economy in order to stay relevant. The other thing that's a no-regret move is to work with governments in your countries to shape policy, to drive a business-friendly direction of, because all of this needs to happen in a policy environment, in a policy context, and helping governments. And I think that government-business partnership is really important. In this highly innovative world where AI is progressing so rapidly, technology disrupts itself so rapidly, it is really hard for governments to keep up without getting the help from businesses to understand how to regulate this, how to drive change here, and how to create positive momentum.
What is the now what? What are the next immediate practical steps that leaders can take to effectively engage with and understand the opportunities presented by the Global South, whether you're in the Global South or in the Global North?
Now what for the Global North? Think of how do you bring a non-Western gaze into those conversations in order to unlock white spaces and find new growth. Won't be as easy as it was in the past, but it exists, but requires a different perspective. And now what for the governments of the Global South? Continue to think economy over politics. Continue to support businesses and your populations to go up the curve, but do this in a way that does not cause inequality to go higher. Because if that leads to rampant inequality, if that leads to social tension, and it's not inclusive growth for your population, it's not sustainable. The now what for businesses in the Global South is upskill and innovate. Find a reason for which your quality bar can be higher and higher and close the gap to quality of products in the Global North. And that's the path to multiple decades of relevance, not just a couple of quarters of relevance or a couple of years of relevance.
Aparna, thank you so much. And to you for listening. A note to the listener, BCG recognises the world's trade and tariff situation is highly volatile. The messages in this episode remain relevant even as the landscape shifts. We'd also love to know your thoughts. To get in contact, leave us a message at sowhat@bcg.com. If you like this podcast, why not hit subscribe and leave a rating wherever you found us. It helps other people find us too. And if you'd like to dive deeper into the opportunities and challenges facing the Global South, check out the link in our show notes.